Absolute horror show that the Conservatives have inflicted on working people in this country, on our public services, on anybody paying a mortgage. Every one of them has been punished by the incompetence of the Conservative government.
That is more money for Scotland's NHS, schools and other vital public services. The fact is that this is an incompetent SNP government that is bad with taxpayers' money. So more of the same won't cut it.
I tell you what, John Swinney's got some front. The man whose dirty fingerprints are all over the tram scandal, the ferry scandal, the Salmond inquiry scandal, the named persons scandal. How much has this man's mistakes cost all of us?
The Steamie Politics Podcast from The Scotsman.
Hello and welcome to The Steamie, The Scotsman's Politics Podcast. I'm Alistair Grant, the political editor of The Scotsman, and I'm joined by David Ball, The Scotsman's deputy political editor, by Rachel Amery, The Scotsman's politics correspondent, and by Andrew Quinn, The Scotsman's Westminster correspondent. And it's been another pretty crazy week in Scottish politics. I think it's fair to say later on we'll be previewing the three party conferences taking place this weekend, the Scottish Conservatives, the Scottish Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Greens, including sitting down with Scottish Lib Dem leader Alex Cole-Hamilton, who says his party can stop the SNP securing its much sought after majority in May. But before we talk about all of that, we should touch on the extraordinary political row that's been developing over the last couple of days over the Lord Advocate and the Peter Murrell case. So this is Scotland's most senior prosecutor who has been forced to deny giving political advantage to John Swinney when she told the First Minister details of the charge that his party's former chief executive is facing. Dorothy Bain, KC, was in Holyrood on Wednesday to defend, sending a minute to Mr Swinney revealing details of the charge against Peter Murrell, who's also Nicola Sturgeon's ex-husband. That minute she sent on January 19th, which came out following a Freedom of Information request, said the former SNP chief executive was facing a charge of having embezzled £459,000 from the SNP. That detail, that information sent to the First Minister, not all aspects of that were public. It emerged before the information was sent to the First Minister before details of the charge were published on February 13th. And opposition MSPs have claimed that the Lord Advocate gave political advantage to the First Minister by giving him access to that detail. This is obviously, it's quite a complicated story. We're slightly restricted, well, quite a lot restricted in what we can say about it because it's an active case, there's contempt of court rules. But Rachel, John Swinney at First Minister's Questions, FMQs was dominated by this today, and he launched a very, very staunch defence of Dorothy Bain, accusing the Scottish Tory leader Russell Finlay of making, I think he said, contemptible accusations. What did you make of all this?
Yeah, it was quite a heated exchange, both with First Minister John Swinney and the Scottish Conservative leader Russell Finlay, and with John Swinney and the Scottish Labour leader Anna Sauer, because both of them were asking questions about this today. Probably good to remind listeners at this point, the Lord Advocate is part of the Scottish Cabinet. She holds a position within the government here. And so that's why she was in Holyrood yesterday to answer questions and why she was in the debating chamber. Now, John Swinney getting quite annoyed, quite angry, and sort of launching quite a staunch sort of defence of the Lord Advocate today at First Minister's Questions, saying that he has full confidence in her and criticising the other opposition parties for the way that they spoke about her yesterday, saying it was appalling and disgusting and that they should be ashamed of themselves. So really quite strong language here. And he also asked Russell Finlay to retract what he had said, saying it was contemptible rubbish. So it was quite something to watch. It was, I don't know if it's because we're getting close to the election or if it's because it'll be a very difficult week or for what reason, but I feel like tensions have really started to bubble over when it comes to this particular story here. And we really saw that today. Anna Sauer was trying to sort of be a bit more sort of like meticulous in sort of the back and forth that he was going for. But again, you saw the First Minister getting quite annoyed about the comments he was making and very keen to defend the Lord Advocate the whole way here. And so we've heard other people this morning on the radio, for example, other lawyers, again, coming to her defence, saying she's a top prosecutor, she's got years of experience here. This is not how she should be reacting. And for those of us who watched the Lord Advocate, when she spoke in Parliament, this is on Wednesday afternoon that she spoke, she did look a little bit uncomfortable. It's not necessarily what her job is. I mean, politicians shout and ramming at each other in the debating chamber all the time, and they're constantly flinging insults back and forth to each other. Not quite the same in the courtroom. So it's probably a little bit out of her comfort zone yesterday, but it's certainly going to rumble on for quite a long time, I think, at this point, because this case could go on for as long at this point as we have heard in the papers this week. So it could be as long before this comes to a conclusion.
Yeah, David, I mean, Rachel kind of touched on it there, but this was such a heated exchange. It's probably the most passionate I've seen John Swinney at First Minister's questions in a long time in terms of the defence he launched for the Lord Advocate. But there was also, and Rachel touched on this again, talk of separating that dual role the Lord Advocate has. She's obviously the chief legal advisor to the government. She's also head of the prosecution service. There's long been talk in Scotland that those two roles are not always, don't always sit easily together, especially when you have these big kind of political cases that have a huge kind of political interest to them. I mean, John Swinney was very keen to say that that kind of dual aspect of that role dates back to the Scotland Act 1998, and that to change it, you would basically require action in Westminster, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. But you have to remember, Nicola Sturgeon kind of heavily suggested that she was looking at splitting this role. But obviously now with this happening, it wouldn't look great on the government if they decided that they needed to because of this episode. It is a complicated thing. Obviously, there's a lot of history and precedent set into the role of the Lord Advocate. So it's easier said than done. And I don't think they want to make it look like there was a problem here. Because Russell Finley's accusation of corruption, like you said, I've never seen John Swinney so angry. He was like literally fizzing with rage at FMQs at those accusations yesterday, and repeated today by Russell Finley. So it is a bit complicated, and it's a bit of a mess. I think corruption is obviously overstepping the mark. There's not actually evidence that corruption has taken place here, but there's a lack of explanation as to why some of those details that you mentioned earlier were sent to John Swinney. And as Rachel said, the Lord Advocate is not used to this sort of scrutiny and kind of attacks on her character. I remember a few months ago, she was in Parliament before the Peter Murrell case had come to fruition, and there were delays with the Crown, and some journalists tried to kind of doorstep her, which is a thing we would do with politicians to get answers, and she was very uncomfortable, quite rightly, because it's just not the territory she's used to. So I don't know what happens next, but that role of the Lord Advocate will be looked at, that dual role, and whether it should be split up to it. Because if it had been split up, if they'd managed to, it would potentially have avoided some of these questions and accusations that the SNP government is now facing. Yeah,
and there are definitely some questions that need to be sort of picked over. I mean, I think one of the points that Anna Sauer was making was this idea that that I think the Lord Advocate touched on yesterday, that the indictment was a kind of public document to some extent, because the moment it's kind of served on the accused, I guess the accused could make it public. But I thought the First Minister went slightly further than that when he said that the point the Lord Advocate made yesterday is the minute the indictment is served on the accused, it becomes a public document because it can be made public as a consequence of that. And it's just worth saying to listeners that the Crown Office was telling me and other journalists at the end of last week that the indictment is not a public document until it's presented in open court. So those two statements don't really seem to marry up, and it's a source of huge frustration to me that they don't. So I'd quite like some further clarity on that. But we should probably move on, because as I say, we're very limited in what we can and should say about this because of contempt of court rules and the fact that it's kind of a live process. But to move on to the party conferences this weekend, Scottish Tories, Scottish Liberal Democrats, Scottish Greens gathering for their spring conferences. I think they're all in Edinburgh. Kemi Badenoch, the UK Tory leader, is going to be making a speech to the Tory conference on Friday. It's fair to say that polls show the party on course for a trouncing at the Holyrood election in May. But I've been speaking to people for a piece that I'm writing for tomorrow's paper within the party, and it's fair to say that there's not a sort of sense of existential despair. Some of them are, maybe upbeat is the wrong word, but there's a sense that they're just going to go forward, they're going to put their case and kind of let the cards fall where they may. What do you think Kemi Badenoch's message will be, and where do you think the party stands?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not as negative as it perhaps once looked. I guess Kemi Badenoch had a very difficult start. She really took time to kind of get into flow. She's managed it quite well, though. I think at Prime Minister's question, she looks a lot stronger than Keir Starmer. And now Robert Jenrick's gone to Reform. Basically, she ousted him with that whole thing where he was plotting to leave. So it's made her look quite strong. But then she's been doing quite well when things have been going better. But it's good, as you say, it's going to go pretty badly for them in May. So that might scupper quite a lot of her progress. I guess there's a few things that she can say. She might go on this sort of thing that the Scottish Tories have been saying, which is saying that actually the Tories are the only ones who are really against another independence referendum, because Malcolm Offord is kind of given a bit of a timeline for how he thinks one could happen. So I can imagine that'll be quite a strong line, and they'll maybe be appealing to more moderate voters. But I guess it's the main issue for the Tories across the UK, as they're really getting drowned out by Reform on the right. So it's going to be quite difficult for her. But I would expect that she'll still stay about. How the Scottish Tories do in May is another thing, though, isn't it? It's like they had two pretty good elections in a row in 2016 and 2021. Where they're ahead, like the Tories being ahead of Labour in Scotland's a big achievement for them, really, because historically it's not been the case over the last half century or 60 odd years or whatever. So, so that's a big deal for them. But that's not going to happen now, and they're almost certainly going to drop to fourth at least, if not further in terms of seats. So it's going to be quite difficult. Will it be Russell Finlay's last conference as Scottish Tory leader as well is a real question, because if things go that badly in May, he could be off, and I'm sure knives will be out anyway, because politicians love infighting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting to see the way that the Tories are trying to distinguish themselves from Reform in Scotland as well. I mean, when I was speaking to kind of senior party figure, they highlighted what they saw as the two main distinctions, one of them being exactly what you said on the Constitution. They have this message that Reform is kind of weak on the Constitution and that they're not sort of standing up for the Union in the way the Scottish Tories are. And the other one is just on credibility. I mean, their kind of messages that Reform, the policies they've announced so far simply aren't credible in the way that they'd argue their own policies are. But Rachel, and I should say I made a mistake there. I think the Scottish Green Conference is actually in Glasgow, but you will be going to that. What do you think will be their kind of key message ahead of the election?
Well, things are quite different for the Scottish Greens compared to the Scottish Tories. They are looking pretty good at the moment. They're most certainly going to improve on the numbers they have at the moment in Holyrood. I think they have 7 just now, one in most of the regions at the moment. So they're looking to do quite well. They've also got new co-leaders under Ross Greer and Gillian Mackay. I've just been speaking to Gillian Mackay down in Holyrood, and she seems quite upbeat, quite excited about the conference this weekend. And is looking forward to it. So it's a bit of a different tone at the Scottish Greens just now, because they are looking to do quite well. The polling just now, I mean, they could be very close in numbers to the Scottish Conservatives, depending on how it goes on polling day. That's how well they are doing compared to how badly the Conservatives are doing right now in the polls. So they will probably be looking to shore up some more votes, get some more support going. I think they'll try and really push some of the list votes as well in the areas that they know they can do well. I think Glasgow and Edinburgh are probably the 2 areas that they'll do well in. I think a lot of people are suggesting they might get 2 MSPs in Glasgow. Now, technically, they did elect 2 MSPs in Edinburgh, or the Lothians, I should say, at the last election. But of course, Alison Johnson stood up the way for her party membership to become presiding officer. So I presume that'll be the 2 areas that they'll really want to look into and see what they can do there. So a bit of a different tone there from them.
And David, you'll be going to the Liberal Democrats who are in Edinburgh. And I think you actually spoke to Alex Cole-Hamilton, the Lib Dem leader. What was he saying?
Yeah, I spoke to Alex Cole-Hamilton ahead of the conference. He was basically making the case that they're targeting these 10 constituencies, which was pretty much double their kind of tally of MSPs. They also want to make some ground on the regional list, which is something the Lib Dems haven't been able to do yet. But they're looking at their kind of performance at the general election, the UK general election, and wanting to kind of build their number of MSPs. But Alec Crampton was basically telling me that he thinks if they can pull off these 10 seats, that they can basically stop the SNP from getting that majority. There was a poll out yesterday on Wednesday showing that they were just 1 seat away from a majority, matching what they got at the last election. So with that being in touching distance, the Lib Dems being able to win those 10 target seats could make a huge difference.
But that's all we've got time for in today's podcast. Thank you very much for listening. Please stay tuned for the Scotsman's website for all the latest news, comment, analysis, and all the reports from those party conferences over the weekend. Until next time, thank you very much.